The spaceship shuddered violently as alarms blared throughout the cabin. Lights flickered on and off, casting an eerie glow over the frightened faces of the passengers. Among them was a small boy named Ethan Parker, clutching his backpack tightly to his chest. His wide eyes darted around the room trying to make sense of what was happening. The adults shouted instructions at each other, their voices tense and panicked. Ethan's mother knelt beside him, gripping his hand firmly while his father worked frantically at one of the control panels. "Hold on tight, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling but calm. "We'll get through this." Ethan nodded, though he didn't fully understand what was going on. All he knew was that something had gone terribly wrong. The ship, which had been traveling smoothly just moments ago, was now spiraling out of control. Sparks flew from the ceiling, and the metallic groan of twisting metal filled the air. Outside the windows, streaks of fiery orange and red painted the sky as the vessel plunged toward an unknown planet below. As the ship hit the atmosphere, the shaking grew worse. Ethan felt his stomach lurch as gravity pulled them downward faster and faster. His mother wrapped her arms around him, shielding him from falling debris. But then came the crash, a deafening explosion that threw everyone forward. The world spun in a blur of smoke and flames before everything went black. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on soft grass beneath a starry sky. The air smelled strange, like burnt sugar mixed with something metallic. His ears rang and his body ached, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. Slowly he sat up and looked around. The wreckage of the ship lay scattered across the field, its once shiny surface now charred and broken. Fires crackled here and there, lighting up the dark landscape with an orange glow. "Mom? Dad?" Ethan called out, his voice shaky. He stumbled to his feet, brushing dirt off his clothes. "Where are you?" No one answered. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant chirping of unfamiliar insects and the occasional creak of cooling metal. Panic began to rise in Ethan's chest as he realized he was alone. He wandered through the debris, calling out for his parents, but there was no sign of them. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Just as tears started to well up in his eyes, Ethan heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a deep, rumbling growl coming from the edge of the forest nearby. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The trees swayed slightly even though there was no wind. Then, one by one, massive shapes emerged from the shadows. They were dragons, unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. Each dragon stood taller than a house, with scales that shimmered like molten gold under the moonlight. Their wings stretched wide, casting long shadows across the ground. Long tails tipped with sharp spikes swished lazily behind them, and their glowing red eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that made his knees weak. Sharp teeth glinted in their open mouths as they exhaled plumes of smoke. Ethan backed away slowly, his mind racing. There was nowhere to run, no place to hide. The dragons surrounded him, cutting off any chance of escape. One of them stepped closer, its claws digging into the earth with every movement. Ethan squeezed his backpack tighter, feeling the weight of the items inside: a flashlight, a few snacks, and a worn-out book of bedtime stories. None of those things could possibly protect him from these monstrous creatures, but instead of attacking, the largest dragon lowered its head until it was level with Ethan's face. Its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air around him, inspecting him carefully. For a moment, Ethan thought about running, but his legs refused to move. Instead, he stood frozen, staring into the dragon's fiery eyes. Then, almost instinctively, his hand reached into his backpack and pulled out the book. I have stories," Ethan stammered, holding the book up nervously. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the dragon seemed to hear him. The large dragon tilted its head curiously, its gaze shifting to the book in Ethan's hands. Encouraged by the lack of aggression, Ethan took a deep breath and flipped the book open to the first page. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice shaking at first, "there was a brave knight who lived in a kingdom far, far away." To Ethan's amazement, the dragons didn't attack. Instead, they settled down onto the ground, forming a loose circle around him. Their glowing eyes dimmed slightly, and the tension in the air eased. One of the smaller dragons crept closer, curling up near Ethan's feet like a curious puppy. As Ethan continued reading, his voice grew steadier, and a strange calm settled over the group. By the time he finished the story, the dragons were completely relaxed. Some of them had even closed their eyes as if lulled to sleep by the sound of Ethan's voice. Ethan couldn't believe what was happening. These terrifying creatures, who could have easily torn him apart, were now listening to him as if he were some kind of storyteller. For the first time since the crash, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could survive this strange and dangerous planet with the help of these unexpected companions. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the sound of rustling leaves and soft snorts. At first, he didn't remember where he was. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, he thought he was back home in his bed. But then he saw the massive shapes surrounding him. The dragons, and reality came rushing back. The sun had risen, casting golden light over the forest clearing. The dragons were still there, lying in a loose circle around him like a protective wall. Ethan sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. He felt stiff from sleeping on the ground, but surprisingly he wasn't scared anymore. Last night's events played in his mind like a dream. He had read them a story, and instead of attacking him, the dragons had fallen asleep. It seemed impossible, but it had happened. One of the smaller dragons stirred nearby, its glowing red eyes opening lazily. It lifted its head and looked at Ethan, almost as if it were waiting for something. "Good morning," Ethan said softly, unsure if the dragon could understand him. To his surprise, the dragon let out a low hum, a sound that vibrated through the air and made Ethan smile. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was gentle, almost comforting. Encouraged by the reaction, Ethan reached out cautiously, extending his hand toward the dragon. The creature sniffed his fingers before nudging him lightly with its nose. Ethan laughed, feeling a spark of excitement replace his earlier fear. Over the next few hours, Ethan began to notice patterns in how the dragons behaved. They weren't just mindless beasts. They seemed curious and intelligent. When he moved, their eyes followed him. When he spoke, their ears twitched as if listening intently. Ethan decided to give them names based on their personalities. The largest dragon, the one who had lowered its head to inspect him the night before, became Blaze because of the fiery glow in its eyes. A sleek, shadowy dragon with darker scales earned the name Shadow, while a playful, energetic dragon that kept bumping into things was dubbed Ember. As the day went on, Ethan realized he couldn't stay in the clearing forever. He needed food and water, and the dragons didn't seem interested in sharing their meals, which consisted of raw meat they hunted in the forest. Still, Ethan wasn't ready to leave their protection just yet. Instead, he rummaged through his backpack, pulling out the snacks he had brought along. There wasn't much, just a granola bar and a small bag of chips, but it would have to do for now. While eating, Ethan noticed that Blaze was watching him closely. The dragon's head was tilted slightly, its sharp eyes fixed on the granola bar in Ethan's hand. Curious, Ethan broke off a tiny piece and held it out. "Do you want some?" he asked, though he doubted Blaze would eat something so small. To his astonishment, the dragon sniffed the offering and delicately took it from his fingers. It chewed, thoughtfully, then let out another low hum, this time sounding almost pleased. Encouraged by Blaze's reaction, Ethan tried the same with the other dragons. Shadow accepted a crumb of chip, but spat it out immediately, shaking its head in disgust. Ember, however, gobbled up everything Ethan offered, wagging its tail like an oversized dog. Watching the dragons react to human food gave Ethan a strange sense of connection with them. They might be enormous and powerful, but they were also curious and playful in their own way. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to test something else. He pulled out his book of bedtime stories again. The dragons perked up instantly when they saw the familiar object. Ethan grinned, realizing they remembered what had happened the night before. He opened the book to a new story and began reading aloud. The dragons settled down once more, their glowing eyes dimming as they listened. Some of them even closed their eyes completely, as if savoring the sound of his voice. By the end of the second story, Ethan felt a growing confidence. These dragons weren't monsters. They were creatures capable of understanding and responding to kindness. And somehow they trusted him. As he closed the book, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. On Blaze's chest, just above its front leg, were intricate markings etched into its golden scales. They looked like symbols, patterns that repeated themselves in a way that reminded Ethan of ancient writing. Curious, Ethan pointed at the markings and asked, "What does this mean?" Of course, the dragon didn't answer, but Blaze lowered its head closer to Ethan as if inviting him to examine the symbols more closely. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then reached out and traced one of the markings with his finger. The dragon didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, it emitted a soft, melodic hum that resonated deep within Ethan's chest. It was unlike anything he'd ever heard before, a sound that felt both ancient and alive. That night, as the temperature dropped and the forest grew quiet, Ethan huddled close to the dragons for warmth. Their bodies radiated heat, and their steady breathing created a soothing rhythm that helped him drift off to sleep. For the first time since the crash, Ethan didn't feel completely alone. Even though he missed his parents terribly, he found comfort in the presence of these unlikely companions. The following morning, Ethan woke up to find the dragons already awake and active. Blaze stretched its massive wings, sending gusts of wind rippling through the grass. Shadow prowled around the edges of the clearing, sniffing the air and occasionally letting out a low growl. Ember bounded toward Ethan, knocking him over with an enthusiastic nudge. Laughing despite himself, Ethan pushed himself back up and dusted off his clothes. "I guess you're hungry again," he said, patting Ember on the side. The dragon chirped happily, its tail swishing back and forth. Ethan sighed, knowing he'd have to figure out a better source of food soon. His snacks were almost gone, and he couldn't rely on the dragons to provide for him indefinitely. But for now, Ethan focused on building trust. He spent the day talking to the dragons, reading more stories, and pointing out objects in the forest to see if they understood. Sometimes they responded with nods or hums. Other times, they simply stared at him blankly. Still, every interaction brought Ethan closer to understanding them, and to feeling less afraid of the strange world he had landed in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ethan climbed onto Blaze's back. The dragon didn't resist, allowing Ethan to sit comfortably between its shoulders. From this vantage point, Ethan could see far beyond the clearing. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with glowing flowers that lit up the darkness. Rivers wound through the trees like silver threads, and mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. For a moment, Ethan forgot about the crash, his missing parents, and the uncertainty of his future. All he could think about was how incredible it was to be sitting atop a dragon, surrounded by such beauty. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on Blaze's warm scales. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the dragon could hear him. Blaze let out a contented rumble, and Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan knew he still had many challenges ahead. But for now, he was safe. The deadliest dragons on the planet had chosen not to harm him. They had chosen to protect him. And in return, Ethan had given them something rare and precious, a connection built on trust and imagination. The days passed quickly, and Ethan's life among the dragons became a routine he never imagined possible. Each morning, he woke up to the sound of their deep breaths and the rustling of leaves as they moved around the clearing. Blaze was always the first to rise, stretching its massive wings and shaking off the dew that clung to its golden scales. Shadow prowled the edges of the forest, keeping watch for any signs of danger, while Ember stayed close to Ethan, eager to play or nudge him with its snout whenever he seemed too quiet. Ethan spent most of his time exploring the forest with the dragons. They moved easily through the dense trees, their powerful bodies clearing paths where none existed before. At first, Ethan had been nervous about venturing too far from the crash site. What if he got lost? What if his parents were searching for him nearby? But the dragons seemed to know the land well, and they never let him stray too far from their sight. Slowly, Ethan began to trust them completely. One day, as they walked along a narrow trail, Ethan noticed something strange. The trees ahead were covered in glowing vines that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. The colors shifted constantly: blue, green, purple, like liquid rainbows trapped in plant form. Ethan reached out to touch one, but Blaze let out a warning growl, stopping him in his tracks. Ethan looked at the dragon curiously. "What is it?" he asked. Though he didn't expect an answer, Blaze nudged him gently toward a nearby rock instead. Sitting down, Ethan watched as Shadow approached the glowing vines cautiously. The dragon sniffed them once, then backed away quickly, shaking its head. It was clear the vines weren't safe to touch. Ethan frowned, wondering why they glowed so brightly if they were dangerous. He made a mental note to stay away from anything that sparkled or shone unnaturally unless the dragons gave their approval. As they continued deeper into the forest, Ethan discovered more wonders. There were rivers that bubbled with warm, golden water, and fields of flowers that smelled like fresh rain. In one clearing, they found a cluster of enormous mushrooms taller than Ethan himself. When Blaze tapped one with its claw, it emitted a soft chime-like sound that echoed through the air. Ethan laughed, delighted by the discovery. Even in this alien world, there was beauty everywhere. You just had to look closely. But not everything was peaceful. One afternoon, as they rested near a stream, Shadow suddenly froze. Its ears perked up and its tail stiff. Ethan followed the owl, dragon's gaze, and saw movement in the bushes across the water. A pair of large, scaly creatures emerged, reptilian beasts with sharp teeth and long tails. They hissed loudly, their eyes locked onto the group. Ethan felt his heart race. These weren't dragons, they were predators, and they looked hungry. Blaze stepped forward immediately, spreading its wings wide to make itself appear even larger. The other dragons flanked Ethan protectively, forming a barrier between him and the intruders. The reptilian creatures hesitated, clearly intimidated by the size and presence of the dragons. After a tense moment, they retreated back into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Ethan let out a shaky breath, realizing how close he had come to danger. Without the dragons, he wouldn't have stood a chance. That evening, as they returned to the clearing, Ethan decided to thank the dragons properly. He opened his book of stories and read aloud, choosing one about bravery and friendship. The dragons listened intently, their glowing eyes dimming as they relaxed. When he finished, Blaze leaned down and nudged him gently, almost like a hug. Ethan smiled, feeling grateful for their protection. Over time, Ethan began to notice more about the dragons' behavior. They communicated with each other using low rumbles, chirps, and even gestures with their tails. Sometimes, when they were particularly excited, they would puff small bursts of smoke into the air. Ethan tried to mimic these sounds and movements, hoping to learn their language. Though he didn't fully understand them yet, the dragons seemed to appreciate his efforts. They responded with encouraging hums and playful nudges. One day, while sitting near Blaze, Ethan noticed something new about the markings on the dragon's chest. The symbols he had seen earlier weren't random. They formed patterns that repeated themselves in different ways depending on which part of the dragon's body he looked at. Intrigued, Ethan traced one of the markings again, just as he had done before. This time, Blaze tilted its head and made a series of clicking noises as if trying to explain something. "Are these words?" Ethan asked, pointing at the markings. Blaze didn't respond directly, but it lowered its head closer to Ethan, allowing him to examine the symbols more carefully. Ethan wished he had paper and a pencil to sketch them, but he made do by memorizing their shapes instead. Maybe someday, he thought, he could figure out what they meant. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan grew more confident in his ability to communicate with the dragons. He taught them simple words like food, water, and tree, using gestures and drawings in the dirt. In return, the dragons showed him hidden parts of the forest, caves filled with glowing crystals, pools of water that reflected the stars above, and ancient ruins covered in carvings similar to the ones on Blaze's scales. One night, as they rested under the stars, Ethan climbed onto Blaze's back again. From this height, he could see the entire forest spread out below them, bathed in silver moonlight. The sight took his breath away. For a moment, he forgot about the crash, his missing parents, and the uncertainty of his future. All he could think about was how incredible it was to be here, surrounded by these magnificent creatures who had become his friends. "I wish I could tell my mom and dad about you," Ethan whispered, resting his hand on Blaze's warm scales. The dragon let out a soft rumble as if comforting him. Ethan sighed, knowing he couldn't stay here forever. His parents must be looking for him, and sooner or later someone would come to rescue him. Or try to. The thought filled him with mixed emotions. He wanted to go home, but leaving the dragons felt impossible now. For now, though, Ethan focused on the present. He pulled out his book of stories and began reading aloud, his voice steady and calm. The dragons settled down around him, their eyes closing as they listened. Even Ember, who usually fidgeted during story time, curled up quietly beside him. As Ethan turned the pages, he realized something important. These stories weren't just entertaining. They were a bridge between two worlds. Through them, he and the dragons had found a way to connect, despite their differences. When he finished the last story, Ethan closed the book and looked around at the sleeping dragons. Their steady breathing created a soothing rhythm that helped him relax. For the first time since the crash, he felt truly safe. The deadliest dragons on the planet had chosen not to harm him. They had chosen to protect him. And in return, Ethan had given them something rare and precious, a bond built on trust and understanding. As the stars twinkled above and the forest hummed with nighttime sounds, Ethan drifted off to sleep, dreaming of adventures yet to come. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wasn't alone. With the dragons by his side, he could face anything, even the unknown. Ethan's days with the dragons had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Every morning, he woke up surrounded by their warm, protective presence. They shared their world with him, showing him hidden caves filled with glowing crystals, rivers that shimmered like liquid gold, and ancient ruins covered in mysterious carvings. Ethan spent hours sketching those carvings in the dirt, trying to make sense of them. He noticed they looked similar to the markings on Blaze's chest, though he still couldn't decipher their meaning. The dragons seemed patient with his curiosity, often nudging him closer to the symbols or tilting their heads as if encouraging him to keep trying. But one day, everything changed. Ethan and the dragons were exploring a part of the forest they hadn't visited before when Shadow suddenly froze. Its ears twitched, and it let out a low growl that sent chills down Ethan's spine. The other dragons reacted instantly, forming a tight circle around him. Blaze lowered its head, its fiery eyes scanning the trees for danger. Ember stayed close to Ethan, its tail swishing nervously. "What is it?" Ethan whispered, clutching his backpack tightly. He scanned the forest but saw nothing unusual. Then, faintly, he heard it, the sound of voices. Human voices. At first, Ethan thought his heart would leap out of his chest. Could it be his parents? Or maybe rescuers searching for survivors from the crash? Hope surged through him and he started to run toward the sound. But Blaze blocked his path, its massive body unmoving. Ethan looked up at the dragon, confused. "It's okay," he said softly. "They're humans. They won't hurt us." Blaze didn't budge. Instead, it let out a deep rumble, a warning Ethan had come to recognize. Reluctantly, Ethan stopped and listened more carefully. The voices grew louder, and soon he could make out what they were saying. "There's got to be something valuable here," one voice said gruffly. "This planet's resources are worth a fortune." "Yeah, but watch out for those beasts we saw earlier," another replied. "Big ones. Looked like dragons or something." Ethan's stomach sank. These weren't rescuers, they were strangers, and they sounded dangerous. He glanced at the dragons, who were now visibly tense. Their tails flicked, and their claws dug into the ground. Ethan realized they knew these people posed a threat. The group emerged from the trees moments later. There were 5 of them, all dressed in rugged uniforms and carrying weapons. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. His name was Victor Lane, though Ethan didn't know that yet. Victor's cold eyes scanned the clearing, taking in the sight of the dragons and the small boy standing among them. "Well, well," Victor said, smirking. "Looks like we've found ourselves a local guide." Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding. Who are you?" he stammered. Victor ignored the question. "Kid, those things behind you, are they friendly? Or should we shoot first and ask questions later?" "They're not going to hurt anyone," Ethan blurted out, stepping in front of the dragons protectively. They're my friends." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Friends, huh? Funny how beasts that size let a little kid call the shots." He turned to his team and nodded. "Keep your weapons ready. If they so much as twitch wrong, take 'em down." Ethan's mind raced. He had to stop this before it escalated. The dragons trusted him, and he couldn't let them get hurt because of these strangers. Summoning all his courage, he spoke loudly, his voice trembling but determined. "You don't understand. They're not dangerous unless you attack them." Victor laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Right. And I'm supposed to believe a kid over my own eyes? Those things look like they could tear us apart." "They won't," Ethan insisted. Just give me a chance to show you." Victor crossed his arms, looking amused. "All right, kid. Impress me. What's your big plan?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then reached into his backpack. He pulled out his book of bedtime stories, the same one he had used to calm the dragons during their first meeting. Holding it up, he turned to Blaze and nodded. The dragon lowered its head slightly, understanding. Ethan opened the book and began reading aloud. "Once upon a time there was a kingdom ruled by a wise king. The effect was immediate. The dragons settled down, their glowing eyes dimming as they focused on Ethan's voice. Even Victor and his team paused, watching in stunned silence as the massive creatures became eerily still. For a few moments, the only sounds were Ethan's steady voice and the rustling of leaves in the wind. When Ethan finished the story, he looked up at Victor, hoping the man would see reason. "See? They're not monsters. They're just different." Victor frowned, clearly unsettled but unwilling to admit it. "Cute trick, kid, but we're not leaving without what we came for." "What did you come for?" Ethan asked cautiously. "Minerals," Victor replied. "This planet's loaded with them, worth more than you can imagine. Now move aside before someone gets hurt." Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, you can't stay here. This is their home." Victor's patience snapped. "Enough of this." "Nonsense," he barked, raising his weapon. "If you won't move, we'll move you ourselves." Before anyone could act, Blaze stepped forward, spreading its massive wings and letting out a deafening roar. The ground shook beneath their feet, and Victor's team instinctively raised their weapons. Shadows shifted nervously while Ember growled low, its tail lashing angrily. "Don't do it," Ethan shouted, stepping between the two groups. "Please, there's no need to fight," Victor sneered. "Get out of the way, kid. You're in. Over your head." Ethan clenched his fists, tears welling up in his eyes. He didn't know what to do. If the dragons attacked, people might get hurt, but if Victor and his team fought back, the dragons could be injured or worse. It was a nightmare he couldn't escape. Then, an idea struck him. Frantically, he turned to Blaze again. "Let me try one more thing," he pleaded. "Trust me." Blaze hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Taking a deep breath, Ethan climbed onto the dragon's back. The others watched in stunned silence as Blaze lifted off the ground, carrying Ethan high above the clearing. From this vantage point, Ethan could see both the dragons and Victor's team clearly. He held his book tightly and began reading another story, his voice carrying over the tense scene below. "This is a story about two enemies who learn to trust each other." As Ethan read, the dragons calmed further, sitting down and lowering their heads. Victor and his team exchanged uneasy glances, lowering their weapons slightly. Ethan's voice was steady now, filled with hope and determination. When he finished the story, he leaned forward on Blaze's back, addressing Victor directly. "These dragons aren't your enemies," he called out. "They're intelligent, and they deserve respect. Please just leave them alone." Victor stared up at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he lowered his weapon completely. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll go for now. But this isn't over, kid." With that, Victor signaled his team to retreat. They disappeared into the forest, leaving Ethan and the dragons alone once more. As Blaze landed gently on the ground, Ethan slid off its back, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The dragons gathered around him, their hums soft and comforting. Though the immediate danger had passed, Ethan knew trouble wasn't far behind. Victor wouldn't give up easily, and next time there might not be a story to save them. But for now they were safe, and that was enough. The days that followed Victor's departure were tense. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the man would return, and this time, he might not be so easily convinced to leave. The dragons seemed to sense his unease, staying closer to him than ever before. Blaze often stood guard at the edge of the clearing, its fiery eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Shadow prowled the forest silently, disappearing for hours at a time only to reappear with updates, low growls or sharp chirps that Ethan was beginning to understand meant danger or safety. Ethan spent much of his time thinking about what had happened. He replayed the confrontation in his mind over and over, trying to figure out if there was something more he could have done to make Victor truly understand. But no matter how hard he thought, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. Some people weren't willing to listen. Victor wasn't interested in peace or coexistence. All he cared about was taking what he wanted, no matter who or what got hurt in the process. Still, Ethan refused to give up hope. If he could find a way to communicate with the dragons, maybe he could also find a way to bridge the gap between humans and these incredible creatures. He remembered the markings on Blaze's chest, the intricate symbols that looked like writing, and wondered if they held the key to understanding the dragon's world. Maybe, just maybe, those symbols could help him explain to others why the dragons deserved respect. Determined to learn more, Ethan began spending hours sketching the markings in the dirt. He used a stick to trace their shapes carefully, copying them from Blaze's scales whenever the dragon allowed him close enough. At first, the patterns seemed random, but as he studied them, he noticed repeating sequences and curves that hinted at meaning. It was slow work, but Ethan didn't mind. Every line he drew felt like a step closer to unlocking a secret language. The dragon seemed curious about his efforts. Blaze would lower its head to watch him draw, occasionally letting out a soft hum of approval. Ember nudged him playfully when he paused too long, as if encouraging him to keep going. Even Shadow, usually so serious, took an interest, circling around Ethan and sniffing the ground where the symbols were drawn. One afternoon, while working on a particularly complex pattern, Ethan heard a new sound, a series of clicks and chirps, coming from Blaze. He looked up startled to see the dragon gesturing with its tail toward one of the ancient ruins they had visited before. The carvings on the walls of the ruins matched the markings on Blaze's chest almost exactly. Ethan's heart raced. Could the ruins hold answers? Were they connected to the dragons somehow? Excited, Ethan gathered his things and climbed onto Blaze's back. The dragon spread its massive wings and lifted off the ground effortlessly, carrying Ethan high above the forest. Below them, the trees stretched endlessly, interrupted only by rivers and rocky outcrops. Ethan clung tightly to Blaze's warm scales, marveling at the view. When they finally landed near the ruins, Ethan slid off and hurried toward the carved walls. The carvings were even more detailed up close. They covered every surface, forming elaborate scenes that told stories of battles, alliances, and celestial events. Some of the figures resembled the dragons themselves, while others looked like humanoid beings. Ethan traced one of the carvings with his finger, feeling the grooves beneath his skin. "What does it mean?" he whispered, half to himself and half to Blaze. Blaze responded with a series of deep rumbles, tilting its head as if urging Ethan to look closer. Determined, Ethan sat down and began sketching again, this time copying the carvings onto a flat piece of bark he found nearby. Hours passed as he worked, oblivious to the passage of time. When he finally stopped, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Blaze nudged him gently, reminding him it was time to return to the clearing. Back at their makeshift camp, Ethan shared his discovery with the other dragons. Though they couldn't speak human words, their reactions made it clear they understood the significance of the carvings. Ember let out an excited chirp, while Shadow nodded solemnly. Even Blaze seemed pleased, lowering its head to nuzzle Ethan affectionately. That night, as Ethan lay awake under the stars, he thought about everything he had learned. The dragons weren't just animals. They were part of a rich history, tied to this planet in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somehow, he had become part of their story too. It was a responsibility he didn't take lightly, but thoughts of Victor still lingered in the back of his mind. What if the man returned with reinforcements? What if he tried to harm the dragons despite Ethan's warnings? Ethan knew he couldn't face such threats alone. He needed help. But where could he find it? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning. As Ethan and the dragons explored the forest, Shadow suddenly froze. Its ears perked up. A moment later, it darted into the bushes, returning moments later with something clutched in its jaws. It dropped the object at Ethan's feet. An old, battered radio transmitter. Ethan's eyes widened. "Where did you find this?" he asked, picking it up carefully. The device was scratched and dirty, but it looked functional. Shadow chirped softly, pointing with its nose toward the direction it had come from. Realization dawned on Ethan. Someone else must have been here recently, someone who had left the transmitter behind. If he could get it working, maybe he could send a message to anyone searching for survivors of the crash. Maybe he could reach his parents. With renewed determination, Ethan set to work. He opened the transmitter's casing and examined its inner workings. Though he didn't know much about electronics, he had seen his father repair similar devices before. Using tools from his backpack and scraps of metal from the wreckage of the ship, he tinkered with the transmitter for hours. The dragons watched, curiously, occasionally offering encouragement with gentle nudges or hums. Finally, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the transmitter crackled to life. Static filled the air, followed by faint voices speaking in clipped tones. Ethan's heart leapt. "Hello?" he called into the microphone, his voice trembling with excitement. "Is anyone there? This is Ethan Parker. I'm stranded on an uncharted planet." There was a pause, then a response crackled through the static. "Ethan? This is Captain Lewis of the rescue team. We've been searching for you. Are you injured?" "No, I'm okay," Ethan replied quickly. "But I need your help. There are creatures here, dragons. They're not dangerous unless provoked, but there are humans who want to hurt them. You have to stop them." Captain Lewis hesitated. "Dragons. Are you sure about this, Ethan?" "Yes," Ethan insisted. "They're intelligent. They've been protecting me since the crash. Please, you have to believe me." After a long pause, Captain Lewis spoke again. "We'll do our best to locate your position and assist. Stay safe until we arrive." Relief washed over Ethan as he turned off the transmitter. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Help was on the way, not just for him, but for the dragons too. When he explained the situation to the dragons, they reacted with a mix of curiosity and caution. Blaze tilted its head, letting out a low hum, while Ember wagged its tail excitedly. Shadow prowled around the clearing, keeping watch for any signs of trouble. Though they couldn't fully understand what Ethan had done, they seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. As the days passed, Ethan prepared for the arrival of the rescue team. He practiced explaining the dragon's behavior and showed them the carvings he had sketched, hoping the evidence would convince the rescuers to protect the creatures. The dragons stayed close, their trust in Ethan unwavering. Finally, one morning, the sound of engines echoed through the forest. A sleek ship descended from the sky, landing gently in the clearing. Ethan ran toward it, waving his arms. The hatch opened and a group of uniformed rescuers stepped out, led by Captain Lewis. "We've been looking everywhere for you," Captain Lewis said, kneeling to meet Ethan's gaze. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Ethan replied, glancing back at the dragons. "But please, you have to promise me something. These dragons, they're not monsters. They saved my life. You can't hurt them. Captain Lewis exchanged a glance with his team, then nodded slowly. We'll do what we can, Ethan, but you'll need to show us proof. Ethan smiled, knowing he was ready. With the dragons by his side and the carvings as evidence, he was confident he could make them understand. Together, they would find a way to protect this incredible world, and the bond he had forged within it. The rescue team moved cautiously into the clearing, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of the massive dragons surrounding Ethan. Captain Lewis held up a hand to signal his team to stay back, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The dragons, for their part, remained calm but watchful, their glowing eyes fixed on the newcomers. Blaze stood tallest, its wings slightly spread as if ready to shield Ethan at a moment's notice. Shadow prowled the edges of the group, while Ember stayed, close to Ethan, nudging him gently with its snout. It's okay, Ethan said softly, addressing both the rescuers and the dragons. They won't hurt you if you don't hurt them. Captain Lewis nodded slowly, though his expression remained skeptical. All right, Ethan, we'll take your word for it, for now, but we need to understand what's going on here. Ethan stepped forward, holding up the bark he had used to sketch the carvings from the ruins. These symbols are important, he explained. They're part of the dragon's history. They're not just animals. They're intelligent. They've been protecting me since the crash. One of the rescuers, a woman named Rachel, knelt beside Ethan to examine the sketches, her brow furrowed as she traced the lines with her finger. This looks like some kind of language, she said thoughtfully. Do you think they can communicate? I'm not sure, Ethan admitted, but they listen, and they trust me. He turned to Blaze and gestured toward the markings on its chest. See? These are the same symbols I found at the ruins. They mean something. I just don't know what yet. Rachel exchanged a glance with Captain Lewis, who seemed to be weighing the situation carefully. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, let's give this a shot. If these creatures are as intelligent as you say, maybe we can find a way to coexist. Encouraged by the captain's willingness to listen, Ethan led the team to the ancient ruins. The journey was slow, as the rescuers were wary of the dragons, but Blaze and the others stayed close, their presence both intimidating and reassuring. When they reached the ruins, Rachel and another rescuer named Alex began examining the carvings more closely, taking photos and making notes. Ethan watched anxiously, hoping they would see the significance of the symbols. These carvings tell stories, Rachel said after a while. Look, here's a scene of humans and dragons working together, and here, it looks like they're sharing knowledge. Ethan's heart leapt. That's what I've been trying to say. They're not our enemies. They're part of this planet's history. Captain Lewis rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If that's true, then we have a responsibility to protect them, not exploit them. The next few days were spent gathering evidence and documenting the dragon's behavior. Ethan worked closely with the rescuers, showing them how the dragons responded to his voice and gestures. He read them bedtime stories again, much to the amazement of the team, who watched in awe as the massive creatures settled down like obedient listeners. Even Blaze, usually so imposing, seemed almost gentle as it lowered its head to rest near Ethan. As the rescuers prepared to leave, Captain Lewis pulled Ethan aside. We're going to report everything we've learned to Earth Command, he said, but I can't promise they'll agree with us. There are people out there, like Victor Lane, who will see these dragons as threats or resources. It's going to take time to change their minds. Ethan nodded, understanding the challenges ahead. I'll keep trying, he said firmly. I'll keep teaching them. Maybe someday everyone will see the dragons the way I do. Captain Lewis smiled faintly. You've already done more than most adults could. You've given us a chance to get this right. When the time came to board the ship, Ethan hesitated. Leaving the dragons felt impossible. They had become his family, his protectors, and his friends. Blaze stepped forward, lowering its head until it was level with Ethan's face. For a moment, Ethan thought the dragon might try to stop him from leaving. Instead, Blaze let out a soft hum, almost like a goodbye. I'll come back, Ethan promised, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'll find a way to help you. I promise." Blaze nudged him gently, then stepped back to join the other dragons. As the ship lifted off the ground, Ethan pressed his face against the window, watching the dragons grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared from view. Though his heart ached with sadness, he also felt a deep sense of purpose. He had made a connection that transcended fear and misunderstanding, a bond that proved even the deadliest creatures could find peace through kindness and imagination. Back on Earth, Ethan became an advocate for the dragons. He shared his story with scientists, politicians, and anyone who would listen. Using the sketches and recordings he had brought back, he worked tirelessly to prove that the dragons were intelligent beings worthy of respect and protection. It wasn't easy. There were many who doubted him, just as Victor had, but Ethan refused to give up. Years passed, and slowly, attitudes began to change. Expeditions returned to the planet, this time with teams dedicated to studying the dragons and learning from them. The carvings at the ruins were translated, revealing a rich history of cooperation between humans and dragons from centuries ago. With each new discovery, Ethan's mission gained momentum. One day, when Ethan was older, he returned to the planet. The dragons recognized him immediately, rushing to greet him with chirps and hums. Blaze lowered its head, allowing Ethan to climb onto its back once more. Together they soared above the forest, the world below as beautiful and mysterious as ever. Ethan knew his work wasn't finished. There would always be challenges, always people who saw the dragons as threats instead of allies. But as long as he had the dragons and their trust, he knew he could face anything. Under the stars, surrounded by the creatures who had changed his life forever, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had found something extraordinary, a friendship built on trust, imagination, and a shared hope for a better future.